This is part 2 of last night's lecture on Christianity. We had technical difficulties, and half of the lecture was lost. And so we continue our lecture 22, Secularism and Utopia, the Age of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, and Anti-Christian Crusade. And so we had left off discussing why you had such an advancement of secularism occurring at the same time as the Protestant Reformation is occurring, and the Renaissance. And we were discussing because of the Protestant Reformation, or in light of the Reformation and the change that came with it, wars were one of the ramifications of those actions. And we initially listed out wars that were inspired by the Reformation. These were not directly caused by the Reformation, but inspired by, or the Reformation contributed to the reasons that the wars happened. And we mentioned the 30 Years' War that killed 1/3 of German population, and then the 9 Years' War, which was in France, 1688 to 1697, where you had Catholics versus Protestants fighting. You also then had wars and conflicts where that are the direct result of kings converting to Protestantism and then forcing their subjects to follow them. This occurred in Sweden. The three Delcarlian rebellions that took place, as well as the Dake War of 1542 to 43. This is where Catholics are rebelling or fighting the imposition of Lutheranism on them. In Denmark, you have the Counts' War, 1534 to 36. Catholics in England rebelled against Henry VIII. The several examples here is the Bigods Rebellion of 1537 and the Prayer Book Rebellion of 1549. This is the institution of the Book of Common Prayer, and again, Catholics rebel against the imposition of this upon them. Conflicts between the principalities within the Holy Roman Empire. Within the Holy Roman Empire, the emperor of that empire remained Catholic, but the princes, some of the princes within his empire that were nobility under his authority, they rebelled against him. You have the first and second Schmalkaldic War, 1546 to 47, and 1552 to 55. The Strasbourg's Bishops' War, 1592 to 1604, are just a couple of examples of the conflicts within the Holy Roman Empire between nobility. Then you have Protestants versus Catholics in the sense of one nation conquering another and imposing their religion on the other. This is highlighted in the conquest of Ireland by England between 1536 to 1603. It involved the banning of Catholicism in Ireland, dissolving monasteries, making Anglicanism the state religion. And as we had noted, I believe, the dissolving of monasteries is ubiquitous within the Protestant Reformation. In terms of the Protestant rulers, one of the things they do almost without exception is to dissolve the monasteries, seize the monastic lands, as well as other charitable foundations, and transfer them to the state. You have the French Wars of Religion between Catholics and Huguenots, 1562 to 1598. 2 to 4 million people die in that conflict within France. The Huguenot rebellion also then in 1620s. And then you have the attempts to force a kind of Christian utopian state. And this, you have the Anabaptists doing this in the Munster Rebellion of 1534 to 35. And then, of course, the English Civil War is a Puritan attempt at this, 1642 to 51, King George is killed. And Puritanism is basically imposing their faith on everyone within the English society. So all of these conflicts also result in the spread of secularism and the disillusionment with religion. At the same time that the Reformation is occurring, you also have the Renaissance, which is a humanist answer to the question of meaning. Roman Catholicism answers, in a sense, the question, why are we here? What are we here for? And so forth. In one way, the Protestants have an alteration to that answer that has significant ramifications for society, as we have seen. But you also have a humanist movement that's trying to answer these questions. And their answers also lead to an expansion of secularism. So humanism is an optimistic response to looking for good in the world and man's ability to effect a positive change in the light of the more pessimistic outlook that Roman Catholicism had in the Middle Ages, and increasingly so with Calvinism as well. God is not necessarily rejected within humanistic thinking, but man's ability is elevated to varying degrees. Many of the early humanists, like Petrarch and so forth, never denied their Catholic faith, but what they did do is they looked, in a sense, to the world to seek solutions, and to the ancient writers of the Greeks and the Romans who were pagan for inspiration. They skip over, in a sense, the Christian era and go back to pagan Rome for their inspiration, while still kind of remaining Christian. And so this has an effect over time, beginning, of course, in the 16th century and moving forward. You see this change in art and culture. During the initial era of the Renaissance, you still have traditional Christian themes, but you're using now the pagan forms of the Roman past to depict these themes. And this shifts slowly away from depiction of Christian themes to focusing on individuals, daily life, national aspirations, political goals, and then also pagan themes, reverting back to the themes of pagan art and culture and literature as you get into the age of the Enlightenment and so forth, the 17th and 18th century and into the 19th. The Virgin Mary is replaced being the predominant figure depicted by Venus, the goddess of sexual desire. Nature becomes the standard of visual art. You depict things as natural as possible, as realistic as possible, in terms of how they are found in the natural world, in the created world. It's not a depiction of a transfigured reality trying to depict, in a sense, the connection between heaven and earth, the meeting of heaven and earth, which traditional iconography does. It's, as you can see behind me, traditional iconography is not Renaissance portraiture. It's trying to communicate a heavenly reality in a material way, but it's not, in a sense, realistic, like a photograph. We're trying to get as close to a naturalistic manner of depicting things. In a sense, the symbolic meaning takes precedent over the physical reality of, let's say, the image being portrayed, the person being portrayed. But you have this changes. The natural depiction of things becomes predominant over, in a sense, the symbolic or spiritual reality. Within Christian themes, using, in a sense, the pagan forms to do so. And then, of course, setting aside those traditional Christian themes and choosing rather to depict the things of daily life and even mythological scenes from pagan mythology and so forth. So paradise, trying to depict, in a sense, paradise, the reality of the kingdom of heaven on earth, or coming to earth, or the next age, is replaced by a vision of an earthly utopia, the perfection of the world, of the material world in this time and place, separate from any kind of paradisical reality. This is the movement within the Renaissance in terms of its influences from humanism. Humanism also, because its focus is on the material world, and you have this encourages what we call the scientific revolution, which is 1543 to 1687 roughly. It's from the days of Copernicus to the days of Isaac Newton. This is the time period that the scientific revolution is considered to be. And you have, from this revolution, a greater ability to manipulate the material world to do, in a sense, what you want. It's not a greater understanding of the world per se as a whole, but it's a greater understanding of how things occur. What are the mechanisms or the manner in which a thing happens, a phenomenon occurs, whether that's gravity or heat or light, its operation. You understand its operation, but that doesn't necessarily give you a greater understanding of what it is and its meaning to you. You can now manipulate it better. You can harness its power or use it better, but it doesn't give you a greater understanding of purpose per se, of why it exists. These are questions outside of the scientific revolution or the scientific method. Questions of meaning are outside of the questions of, in a sense, what science can explain to you. So the result is a greater ability to overcome the restraints of the created world. In a sense, there is now no need to live in harmony with creation, but you can bend creation to your will in a greater extent. You're not restrained as much as you had been. And this also, this greater ability of man to accomplish things is combined with in the age of the Enlightenment, which is a period roughly that historians say stretches from, it's also called the Age of Reason, from René Descartes around 1637 when he lives to up to the French Revolution when it begins in 1789. So a little over 100-year period where the focus again from humanism is on the material world. The scientific revolution has given you abilities to understand it in some ways, or its operation in some ways, to look at it from a certain perspective. And then also the rediscovery of course, in the West, of pagan philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, and having greater access to them. Those also are not just used within the Roman Catholic Church for the sake of their own pursuit of theology, but the humanists are using them as well for the sake of their own goals, separate from, in a sense, the seeking of a greater knowledge of God. There, in the Age of Enlightenment, it's the seeking of a greater understanding of the human existence in this world, often separate from any acknowledgement of God. Many of the Renaissance or the Enlightenment thinkers are deists. They conceive of a supreme being who, like a watchmaker, creates the world, sets it in motion, and then leaves it alone, and so is not involved in it. So they acknowledge a creator, but the creator is in no way involved in his creation. And so it's for them, they, in a sense, are able to, by studying the creation itself, in a sense, come to a greater understanding of reality and of themselves. but this is not in any way a means of understanding the creator or having any kind of relationship with the creator or God. It's very much a human-centric endeavor. So the pursuit of knowledge by means of reason, that reason rooting back to Aristotle and Plato, using reason and the senses, rooted in the scientific method, to gain knowledge, to gain understanding. And the focus was to create human happiness, not to enter the kingdom of heaven or some eternal destiny. And the technological changes of this period, of course, we all know are vast and expansive, and give us the Industrial Revolution. And in many ways, we still are adapting to that reality of the technological changes that we live in at the moment. But Descartes gives us, in a sense, one of the famous sayings from the Age of Enlightenment: "I think, therefore I am," which is a man-centric, reason-centric identity and conception of reality, of the world. I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I exist. And this embodies much of the Enlightenment thinking. In the Christian tradition, enlightenment is a word used for the grace of God touching a person. The grace of God enlightens a man. One is enlightened or illumined in baptism. In the Orthodox Church, we speak of those who have been baptized as the newly illumined, the newly enlightened. That enlightenment traditionally was found not just through reason, but reason in cooperation with divine activity in one's life. But for the age of the Enlightenment, it came through men using reason to examine the sensible world and using that knowledge gained for some means. What those men did with their knowledge was to expand their ability for individuals to assert their desires in the world. The scandalized by wars of the Reformation and counter-Reformation, various philosophies arise to counter Western Christian religion. So in the Enlightenment, you have the emergence of all kinds of things that are in competition or countering, giving answers to the greater questions of meaning, separate from traditional Roman Catholicism in the West, or then the newly arising Protestant churches. So the examples of this is the emergence of the encyclopedia. We forget that the encyclopedia was a movement. The putting together the first encyclopedia was a movement, in a sense, of an anti-evangelism, designed to set out a new good news, discovered by man's reason. Not something given by God, but something discovered by men. And that the encyclopedia was the embodiment of all this knowledge that man had been able to discover or find or understand or create. Diderot is one of the editors of this, of the encyclopedia, and we'll come back to him a little bit later in this lecture. But man can achieve progress without Christianity. This is the understanding of the Enlightenment, the age of Enlightenment thinkers. There is a direct attack against the Augustinian understanding of the world, of existence, and of course, an attack against the idea of original sin, which from an Orthodox perspective, there is some profit in this because we don't have the same understanding of original sin as the Catholic Church does. And in a sense, the depraved existence of man being born into the world in a state of original sin is a rather pessimistic view of humanity again, whereas within Orthodoxy, we don't have the same conception of this. We're born into a fallen world, a world that is now corrupted by sin, and because of sin, death has entered in, and so we have to deal with these things. But we're not born sinful, as opposed to the Catholic idea that everyone's born guilty of the sin of Adam. We're not born guilty of Adam's sin because we did not commit it, but we're born into a fallen world, definitely. But this is a much more optimistic approach to creation or to one's reality than in the West. But again, the Enlightenment is dealing with Christianity as expressed through the Roman Catholic Church in the West. And so original sin and Augustinianism is attacked. The Enlightenment also gives us the origin of our conception of history that we hold to this day, that there is an ancient, then a medieval, and then a modern period. It's the Enlightenment that sets out this structure. The ancient being what was lost to the rise of Christianity, the medieval age, or the Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages. This is how the Enlightenment refers to what comes before it as a dark age. It's where that arises. The Middle Ages, the medieval or the Dark Age, is the age of Christianity, which has to be, in a sense, light has to be brought to it. It's an inversion of the Christian message here, that Christianity comes into the Roman Empire to enlighten, but now the Enlightenment says that it was a dark age, and that they are the ones bringing light. And so their modern period is the period of light. It's the period of rediscovering what was in the ancient past that had been lost, and throwing off Christianity to seek after utopia. And so what does this word utopia mean? This is from Merriam-Webster's online dictionary, the passage on utopia, the word utopia. This word is coined in 1516 by the English humanist Sir Thomas More, who published a book titled Utopia. In this book, he compared social and economic conditions in Europe with those of an ideal society of an imaginary island located off the coast of the Americas. More wanted to imply that the perfect conditions of his fictional island could never really exist. So he called it Utopia, a name he created by combining the Greek words ou, which means not or no, and topos, topos meaning place, like topography. This is where the word topography comes from. Topos is a specific geographic place. So the word literally means no place, no place. The earliest generic use of utopia was for an imaginary and indefinitely remote place. The current use of utopia, referring to an ideal place of society, was inspired by More's description of utopia's perfection. And so the Enlightenment takes up this idea of utopia as being something that you're striving for. You're striving for. Striving for utopia, not the kingdom of heaven, was the aim of the Enlightenment. They retained the sense of history as a movement or progress towards a greater good given to them by the papacy, but rejected the papacy and Roman Catholicism. Christianity still influenced them in some ways, but society was far more secular. Utopia as a goal was sought by persuasion via literature, music, art, politics, and science initially. People like John Locke, Adam Smith, Voltaire, David Hume, Diderot, Edward Gibbon, who gives us this tripartite classification of history in his Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, Kant and Rousseau. These are all major thinkers of the Enlightenment. They influence monarchs like Frederick the Great of Prussia, 1740 to 1786, and Joseph II of the Holy Roman Empire, 1765 to 1790. Joseph II, Holy Roman Emperor, he, in a sense, instituted the end of papal supremacy over the Holy Roman Empire in his day, while still even retaining his Catholic faith. But he was very much a secularizing monarch. He abolished 1/3 of Austria's monasteries, seizing their lands. abolishing a number of saint days. Remember, in a calendar, in the calendar of a kingdom, the saints' days were days off, these were holy days or holidays. And these were days you didn't work. He abolished a number of saints' days for the sake of greater industry, for the sake of greater productivity of the industry. And he also declared marriage a civil institution. Again, bringing, in a sense, the sphere of the secular greater and greater into society. It's also in this age, and especially amongst these monarchs and emperors, where music, our sense of classical music, right, is being manifested. This is the age where music, being a means of worship, gives way to being a means in and of itself. You always had people singing and creating songs and so forth, but it's here that you have this transition from music being a major focus, its major focus being on the worship of God, to now being its major focus being entertainment, or it's the creation of music for the sake of creating music. Entertainment or creative expression becomes the primary purpose of it, not religious. And this would be also the case of art. Art becomes primarily for entertainment, personal gratification, not religious expression. This is found in the works of Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, and Brahms. Even their religious compositions were intended to be listened to, not used to help you pray. And traditional Christian services, going back to the very early days of the church, how you sing and what is sung and so forth was a means of helping you to participate in the worship of God. It was not there for your entertainment or to move you emotionally. It was there to move you spiritually. That's what its function was. But here we have this shift to the focus is the entertainment of the individual or the pleasing of the individual. Not music meant you to allow the heart to speak to God, but music being used to please the person. And so the religious compositions of many of these great composers, you listen to them. You don't stand and pray with them. Instead of music being for the church, music was meant for the concert hall, a secular space. The Enlightenment also influenced sensibilities towards marriage and fidelity. Diderot, who we mentioned as one of the editors of the encyclopedia, he disparaged monogamy. Hume thought marital fidelity only a social utility. Voltaire and Rousseau never married, but they kept mistresses. Diderot married and kept mistresses. Rousseau's progeny, children from his mistresses, he did not care for in any way. He sent them to the orphanage. Marquis de Sade, a playwright in this time period, his novels and plays take the orgy as, in a sense, the places it center stage in the work. An individual's pleasure being primary to everything else, sexual desire being independent of morality and of course Christianity, throwing off the confines of Christian morality. This de-evolution of morality was prominent also, therefore, in the French monarchy. Louis XV married, but he also had an official mistress, and at times he had 3 of her sisters as mistresses as well. This, along with many other women throughout his reign as mistresses, the most notorious being Madame de Pompadour, who dies in 1764. She is a living embodiment of Venus. She was a patroness of the arts that depicted visually the state of the French court's obsession with sexuality. And in this time, much of the art is highly sexualized, coming out of France at this point. Louis XV and his many mistresses left the kingdom financially unstable, because for each mistress, in a sense, they got a royal pension after having pleased the king. And so hundreds, if not thousands, of women were on the payroll of the kingdom. His son, Louis XVI, would spend more money to help the American Revolution. But in helping the American Revolution, this leaves the treasury exhausted in 1788. It is this reason, in this context, which brings him to call in a States General to solve the financial crisis that his kingdom is in. And this is the context of the French Revolution. So I'm going to read a section here from our text, Age of Utopia. This is volume 3 of Paradise and Utopia, the Rise and Fall of What the West Once Was, by Father John Strickland. And this is a section on the French Revolution. When the Estates General finally conveyed in May of 1789, a crisis confronted the absolutist monarchy. The Third Estate fell under the influence of intellectuals and lawyers who demanded the formation of a national assembly to serve the interests of the majority of the population and not only those of clergy and nobility. When Louis scoffed, leaders of the Third Estate formed an insurrection among the sans-culottes in Paris. On July 14, the Bastille, the symbol of absolutist repression, was seized and its garrison brutally massacred. Its commander was beheaded by the mob. Raised upon a pike, his lifeless face gazed down upon the liberated crowds marching through the streets below. The act was only the beginning of a process of bloodletting that would come to be known as the Reign of Terror. In the meantime, the self-proclaimed National Assembly created a constitutional monarchy modeled on that of Britain. One of its first acts was to confiscate all property belonging to the Roman Catholic Church. Next, all monasteries, monastic orders were dissolved. Early in 1790, a law called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy demanded that Roman Catholic priests and bishops swear an oath of obedience to the revolutionary government. Many of the clergy, of course, refused to do so. And this then provoked further acts of repression. To make things worse, I'm jumping ahead here. To make things worse, in 1791, Louis attempted to flee France, disguised, only to be recognized at the front and forced to return to Paris. In 1792, Austria and Prussia invaded France to defend the principle of absolutism of the monarchy. But a hurried campaign of national conscription served to keep the enemy at bay. The invasion, combined with the untrustworthiness of the king, caused great insecurity among the revolutionaries. And the radicals used this as a pretext to massacre hundreds of people who were in prison in Paris. Of course, the first to go were Roman Catholic priests, who were chased down and hacked to pieces in the courtyards of the disbanded monasteries that had been made to serve as prisons. Then, early in the following year, King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette were publicly executed to put an end to any hope for restoration of absolutism. The method used was the newly invented guillotine. This allowed then for the rise of the Jacobins to kind of come to power, which was the most radical of the revolutionary parties. And the leader of this party was Maximilien Robespierre. He leads a committee entitled the Committee for Public Safety. That's the name of the committee. The Committee for Public Safety, that issues thousands of death sentences between 1793 and 94. This reign of terror goes on until his death. Robespierre himself is executed, I believe, in 1794, July. Going back to Father Strickland's text. In the meantime, the revolution was opening opportunities for secularization never dreamed of by the most radical of these philosophies. of the philosophers. In 1793, the government decreed that France would no longer abide by the Christian calendar. Instead of using the incarnation at the beginning of the calendar, linear time would therefore be marked from the birth of Utopia, that is, the year in which the monarchy was abolished. This was a step beyond the tripartite modern model employed by Gibbon. Like the incarnational calendar's organization of time before and after the coming of paradise, the revolutionary one organized the world before and after the coming of Utopia. The names of months were likewise changed, and holidays like the weekly Lord's Day abolished. Streets and other public places were in many cases renamed. Notre Dame Cathedral became the Temple of Reason. That was an atheist cult that placed Voltaire, Rousseau, and, in a sense, Benjamin Franklin as kind of their leading lights in their faith. And then this is all reflected in art, as Father Strickland notes. The artist Jacques-Louis David was to organize an elaborate outdoor festival of the Supreme Being, which is another religious movement that was created to replace the cult of reason by Robespierre. And this artist David himself had been earned respect from the revolutionaries for his anti-evangelical paintings. One, entitled The Death of Socrates, drew upon imagery of Christ's passion, but for the secularist effect. It depicted the great pagan philosopher at the moment of his suicide, bravely pointing upward toward the truth, as 12 disciples, including Plato, prepared to go out into the world to teach his philosophy. And so you see the nature of the French Revolution as an anti-Christian crusade in many ways. And a very bloody one, very bloody one. The Age of Enlightenment comes to an end with the French Revolution. The French Revolution shatters the Age of Enlightenment with its brutality. When utopia had to be achieved by force, the Enlightenment comes to an end. Utopian hopes are dashed for a time, as we see in other cases in history. The idea of utopia will be taken up by others who say, well, they didn't do it right. If I had the chance, I could make utopia happen. And this is what will occur throughout the next few centuries, and even in a sense into our day. This idea of utopia inspires, in a sense, the actions of many. But we'll come to that in other lectures. So for Orthodox, as kind of a reflection on all of the Age of Enlightenment and the rise of the scientific revolution, and the increasing of secularism and the seeking of utopia, why did these things happen? As we noted, these things have their root in the Papal Reformation, in the dividing of society starkly between an elite clergy and everyone else. But for us Orthodox, this is not something we created. We did not have a stark divide between the sacred and the world, between religious and secular, between clergy and laity. The concept of authority from God coming down through the Pope, both temporal and secular, or temporal and religious authorities, sacred authority and temporal authority. In the West, it was through the Pope that these things came. But in the East, this is not how we conceived of authority. Authority from God came both to the bishops and the kings directly. Temporal authority is granted by God. Spiritual authority is granted by God to the bishops. Each side is not in competition with one another. It was supposed to be a kind of symphony between the two. And so this division of society was not did not have, in a sense, you didn't have the impetus for this so much in the East. You also have the presence of married clergy, people like myself, a married priest. And so it's more common for someone to say, my father, my brother, my uncle is a priest. My grandfather is a priest. Because priests have children. Traditionally, they often have many children. And so the ties between clergy and laity are much tighter in the East because of this reality of this married clergy, whether it's priests or deacons. And again, you don't have this bifurcation of society in this way. The church, therefore, is not seen only as the clergy, as we noted earlier in the lection in part 1, but all the faithful, including the king, are in the church. The church encompasses not just one kingdom, but many kingdoms, many kings, many princes, many dukes and nobility. They're all within the church equally. And that's what the church is, all of those people. And so this division of society so much is not as prominent. Now, the West will push these ideas or influence them, of course, to the East in different ways. And we'll be discussing those, like how the Russian Empire is influenced by the West here in the next lecture. But these are, in a sense, things coming from without. They're not originating within. Also, the understanding of history's central point being the incarnation, that what we as Christians are living in is the final days. That Christ has come, that's the central point of history. Everything leads up to it, and then now after it lives in the light of it. And there is no progressing to anything else. We live in the age where Christ is reigning amongst his enemies and putting them, as St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:25, for he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. And how does he do that? By making them his friends, by making his enemies his people, bringing them into the church. Right? This is how Christ subdues his enemies, by saving them, by offering them salvation. And this is the age we live in. There's no progressing to anything else. So our conception of history is also therefore different. So the need for a secular space, in a sense, did not arise so much in the East as it did in the West. And then also the seeking of a utopia did not arise in the East so much because there was no need for it. There was no longing for it. The longing is for paradise, for heaven and earth to manifest itself, for heaven to manifest itself in earth. That's the thing one longs for. And that still is understood as being possible in the East, as opposed to in the West, that it was something put off until one's death. But because of these differences, history takes a different track in each part of Europe. History does not need to be a movement of one reformation or revolution to the next. We have no utopian delusion, but we understand that heaven can touch the earth through life in the church, which is exemplified in the lives of the saints. The way has been made clear by Christ. The difficulty is for us to take up our cross and therefore follow it. There is no need for reinvention. Therefore, there is no need for a reformation or a revolution, but just an implementation of the commandments as given to us by Christ. Next week, we will move on and discuss specifically the Russian Empire and the influence of the West upon it, and then the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, and how that affects Christianity, the emergence of, in the same time period, the independence of Greece and the Balkan people coming out of a dark age, a real dark age under Ottoman oppression, in some ways only to come up under some form of a European oppression in many ways. We'll be discussing that, as well as then the Crimean War. And what does that show us about, in a sense, the plight of Christianity in the 19th century? So God bless you. Thank you.